The Westport Public Library presents Joanna Greenfield discussing her new book, The Lion's Eye, Seeing in the Wild, the story of her mission to connect with animals, on November 5th, 2009.
Hello, and thank you all for coming out on a cold and rainy night. I don't know if I would have done it myself. Really appreciate it. And first of all, I'd like to thank the library. I have found libraries everywhere I've lived in America to be the teachers and the therapists of every town, the center of the town, and they've always changed a town for the better. One librarian told me once when I was apologizing for taking out 6 mystery stories a week, and she said, "There's no such thing as a book that doesn't teach you something." So I hope this book teaches somebody something too. The library asked me to speak more about the process of writing the book than about the book itself. And I'd like to start by saying that this wasn't a book, this was an obsession. And so it wasn't quite the normal way somebody would write a book. I wrote about 7,000 pages, and I tried ferociously to stop myself from writing because I had no life. I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and then 5 o'clock in the morning, and you can imagine how I felt when I woke up again at 7 o'clock in the morning, 5 minutes before I had to get up. So I took writing classes to try to at least get the writing out on a more normal schedule, and it made it worse and worse. And in the end, the only job I could really hold down was a temp secretary position because I couldn't concentrate on anything else. So it took 23 years to write these 7,000 pages. This is a very, very small part of the real book as a whole, but hopefully I have 4 or 5 more books in those 7,000 pages. Oliver Sacks said that temporal lobe epilepsy can cause a sense of revelation and an obsession with writing, but that any great shock can trigger that spark to the brain. And I think it was Africa that triggered that shock and the loss of Africa. And before I talk about Africa, I'd like to talk about what happened to it. President Reagan in America passed the global gag order, which banned the World Health Organization from using any organization that did abortions anywhere from doing anything for them. And those organizations were the places that were giving condoms and AIDS prevention information to Africa. And within the 5 years between my first trip and my second trip, the population of the areas I had been more than doubled and had gone from being very incredibly stunningly beautiful, sustainable places to being places of pain and poverty. And so I hope everybody will support the global gag order if we get a president who tries to overturn it again. President Obama overturned the global gag order. I'm going to read you a few pieces about the savannah to show you why people who go there are never the same, and then talk about the process of unwillingly and reluctantly being forced to write this 7,000-page book. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about this at all, but most of the book is about me being seriously abused by nature. And in the last 2 weeks, I've had the flu. I've been hit by a deer on the highway and gotten a Lyme disease deer tick bite. So if I look a little frazzled, that would be why. That first day, as we rattled and creaked across the savannah, we saw a giraffe we'd been watching from a distance finally rear back and stilt away from a faint green tree. This, our teacher explained, was an acacia. Silver leaves sprouted so small between its huge thorns that the bush looked like a man whose height was all in his feet, turned upside down. The thorns jutted in all directions, casting shadows that on another tree would have belonged to the leaves. This acacia was called a whistling thorn, named by natural history. The bush didn't just whistle, though. It shook and rattled the thorns together like bones clicking. The thorns were as long and dry as shards of sheared-off branches, and it took only a small wind to set them squeaking and rubbing up against one another, with little taps and clatters. As the wind passed, the bush sat still, so faintly tinted it looked like nothing more than a small cloud drifting over the grasses. The scent of a wild animal hung over it in a secondary cloud of musk and freedom. Leaning forward to see what the backlit giraffe had done to the acacia, I touched the branch. There were no gaps in leaf or thorn. The foot-long tongue must have stripped the leaves erratically. The giraffe had stood there for an age, curling its tongue in yanks at the branches and shaking the ants off in slow motion. The only real signs of the giraffe's assault were the ants, still swarming with antennae flailing, up and down the east side of the bush. It was the ants' homes that whistled, the teacher told us. Acacias grow hollow balls amid the thorns for the ants to live in, and the ants pay rent by swarming over the antelope and giraffes as they graze on the leaves. Giraffes have tough tongues and long eyelashes, but they don't stay long once the full force of ants has been roused from its whistling homes. Into gold distances the savanna spread, from peaks and around pillars of stone, through clouds of acacia and green heights, from one country to another. The savanna filled my chest, lungs opening and breathing without stop, one breath finished and another beginning, like a sail blown taut and moving its owner onto the sea. To the curves of the earth, the horizon was lighted. The light halted the movement of time and past and future. For a few seconds, an eternity of peace. The bubbles clinked and clattered with dry silver sounds like the thorns, but they also whistled. A breeze picked up the thorns and tossed them into a tangle, and I heard the wind faintly blowing over all those hollowed holes. Through the tinkle and clicks and squeaks and the rattles and rubs wove a little high-pitched scream, or maybe a moan. The movement of the thorns, like all the wind, captured in miniature and magnified for our eyes. To give you the background of how I ended up in Africa studying chimpanzees in the impenetrable forest of Uganda, I was born with a lazy eye that made it very hard to see depth, and human faces are so ambiguous in their emotions that I couldn't read them. But animals signal their emotions with their mane and their tails and by raising their fur, and I saw epic passions in them, and I couldn't watch them enough. But I had very little access to animals. In Westport, we didn't have pets, so I would sit in the backyard and watch the squirrels and try to pick up the toads. And when I did come across a dog or a cat or a ferret or a lizard, I would stare at it, trying to get my two eyes to work together and focus on the animal so that I could see it. And unfortunately, when you stare at an animal, you're mimicking the behavior of a predator. And I terrified them. And there wasn't one animal that would let me come near it. I was trying to worship them, and they were either biting me or running away to the nearest human being for protection from me. But when I was 6 years old, my parents finally yielded and let me kidnap our next-door neighbor's cousin's dog, a beagle he was driving around the country on a motorcycle. And she took me to the woods, and I learned to see through her eyes in a way that humans usually don't see. I could watch the movement of hawks in the fields and see where a mouse had been taken and see where deer had walked and follow the rabbits, definitely. And I felt those moments of light, seconds of time, for seconds. And I knew somehow from the time I was 2 or 3 years old that Africa was the place that I was born to live in, and that was the place I was going to be able to see the things I wanted to see. And I started asking my mother when I was 3 or 4 when we were going to Africa, and she thought that was funny until I turned 21. So when I was between my junior and senior years in college, I had been given an internship with Coco, the signing gorilla, and I was all set for a lifetime in Africa. My plan was I would work with Coco for a year, go back, finish my senior thesis, publish it, get into graduate school,